Hey, what's up you guys? I'm Sarah Lubratt, and today we are going to be talking about what I learned about writing from reading A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J Maas. Technically, it's things I learned rereading A Court of Mist and Fury because I read it for the first time a couple years ago, but I recently reread it, and while I was rereading it, in addition to really appreciating the storytelling even more than I did the first time, things were jumping out at me on why I think that book is so freaking good, and I wanted to talk about that today. There will be absolutely no spoilers in this video because I've extracted what I really liked about this book and what I learned about writing from this book and distilled it into writing advice and what I learned about writing from this, and so there will be absolutely no spoilers because everything is very extrapolated. A Court of Mist and Fury is from the A Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J Maas. However, it is book 2, but also in my opinion the best book out of the series thus far, and definitely one of the most memorable. I have attempted to organize this video, but there will be timestamps if you just want to scroll along the bar if you want to skip around and watch certain parts. But without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing I want to talk about today are her descriptions. A Court of Mist and Fury is written from the point of view from an artist, and so for a large portion of the book, she's noticing colors, textures, objects that she might want to paint, which is an interesting way to add description to the story, but even outside of the perspective of a painter, the book's description is very specific and very dense. And because of those two things, it's very realistic. In scrolling back through the book, because I was reading it on my phone, I did come across a couple examples that I wanted to share. Again, none of these include spoilers, so you're all good if you have not read the book. She jerked her bloody chin, then wiped it with a napkin as she realized she'd made a mess. She made a face. Blood gleamed on her teeth. All of the description is, well, very descriptive, and it helps build a world around the story itself. It also makes the characters feel much more real because we are getting that sense of the things that you notice in a conversation or in the world. And then I'll be touching on world building itself a little bit later in the video, but from description, I want to go straight into dialogue tags. All of the dialogue tags are very descriptive, or at the very least are descriptive, to really give a sense of real conversation happening and not just words of dialogue going back and forth. Because people do make facial expressions, they do move about as they're talking, and Sarah J Maas does a very good job about including that in the dialogue between characters. I hardly remember any he said, she said dialogue tags, and when I was going back through, I was able to find a few, but they were almost always followed by a comma and a descriptor of what's happening within the conversation, which again, I mean typically a character movement or something. But a lot of the time she doesn't even say he said, she said, whatever. I was able to find some examples of what I mean by that, and I mean that she wrote, "He twisted in his seat towards me," as this character's part of the dialogue tag. I did find an "I whispered," which I think is a lot better than "I said," a twitch of his lips, and then followed by dialogue. "I clamped my lips to keep my smile in," and then dialogue. So there's a lot of conversation descriptors rather than the he said, she said dialogue tags. Within the dialogue itself, and even the narration itself, I found myself amazed at the use of hyphens and ellipses. In school, at the very least, we are warned against using things like exclamation points and ellipses because overuse of them kind of drags down the story and is a little bit too distracting. However, there was a page in A Court of Mist and Fury where I saw 3 ellipses, so Sarah J Maas clearly does not shy away from them, and from this experience of rereading A Court of Mist and Fury, I finally figured out why. It is a very effective way in dialogue and narration to show pattern, style, hesitation, any point where the character is thinking or second-guessing themselves or even speeding up or slowing down their verbal exchanges. Yes, this can probably be overused, and I think it makes a lot of sense to include this more in dialogue than necessarily in the narration, but I was very impressed with how it was used in narration and how much that really allowed me as a reader to see inside of the main character's head and kind of what their hesitations were, kind of where they were trying to stop themselves from thinking a certain thing. And I did not notice that on my first read through this book, and so I thought that was fascinating. Something else that I learned that I suppose maybe I should be unlearning from my creative writing classes is to stay away from flashbacks, memories, and dreams. Sarah J Maas does not shy away from those 3 things in the slightest and actually uses them to her advantage. Most of the flashbacks that were used in this book were actually so that the reader did not have to follow along in an entire day if the other events of the day weren't all that important to the story itself. And what I mean by that is that Sarah J Maas would skip a day, and then as the main character is talking to another character, something that other character would say would pretty much trigger a memory or like a slight flashback to something that happened the previous day, and then that story gets shared in pretty much a short summary by sharing a specific quick story about whatever it was that memory triggered for that character. I realized that this was a great way to cut out a lot of dead space in a story by pretty much just keeping the important parts in the story, and then as needed, if anything is happening on a day off where like the story doesn't follow the characters, that can be easily added the next day in a memory. I also noticed that these flashbacks and memories never tended to take up more than a page or two. They were very short and sweet and did not detract from the pacing because of it. And with that being said, the next thing we're moving into is pacing. Something is always happening in this book. There is absolutely no wasted space or wasted words. Even when characters flirt a little bit, the shift is very quickly moved back to the plot itself. Especially when characters want to keep flirting, they get interrupted, and that keeps the story moving. It kind of like strings you along. There are parts of the story that are long and drawn out, but move really quickly because of the writing, and then there are snappier, quicker sections that are a little bit snarkier, that are almost abbreviated down versions. Like in one of the longer portions, the writing might say, "He let out a low chuckle," and then I found in one of the snappier sections, instead of saying "he let out a low chuckle," it was "a low chuckle," and then his response. And I thought that was very interesting with how that like kept the pacing moving really, really quickly, and how when things needed to be longer and have more explanation in them, they did, and when things needed to be shorter and quicker, they were. Getting to reread this book and experience the amount of emotion in the writing floored me. A lot of the characters are healing and coping because a lot of them have been through some very, very, very traumatic things. Mentioned in book 2, which A Court of Mist and Fury is, also book 1, A Court of Thorns and Roses, as well as like many, many years previous to that, and they're still healing and working on themselves. And in that, I was finding that Sarah J Maas has very, very few characters that are just like two-dimensional. All of her characters are very 3D in that they have their entire own lives. They could be the main character of the book if the POV was shifted, because they are completely whole. They have their own lives. They are not there to just bring the story along, but they have purpose in the story, and they are the main character of their own story, not just a side character in this one. And a lot of that healing and coping that the characters have to go through, they do talk about it with one another sometimes, and they do try to help each other when they can, even if it's not talking about it. A lot of the characters use humor and fighting and flirting to pull themselves out of really bad days, and almost use those things as coping mechanisms to help themselves get better and work through those things in the long run. And while we're talking about the characters, I do have to say that these characters are so well-rounded, and they're so snarky and sassy, and they're so likable even if they're not at first. And I think it's because of how well-rounded her characters are, and how absolutely multifaceted they are, because they have their own lives, and it's like this world is real. Part of what makes these characters so absolutely lovable is that they've gone through so much pain and hurt, and a lot of that is pain and hurt within their own families. And so now that they've like come to this point in the book and the series, they've found each other and have basically become a found family. And I know that that's like a very strong trope in today's writing, but I also think that it's so important to be noticed, and it's so important to readers that they get to pick who their family is and who their friends are. And that just really, really, really adds to the likability of the characters, because we get to see them as friends and getting to pick the people that they love and adore and surround themselves with. As a part of that, most of the characters have very tragic backstories. Yes, I've already touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to touch on it a little bit more. The characters that have absolutely gone through hell are recovering. They have gone through pain and they are forgiving, have been broken and remain kind, but most importantly, never forget their power or their strength. And yes, sometimes it kind of gets lost in how they're feeling, but ultimately they do come back to themselves and they come back stronger than ever. And it's so cool to get to see varying levels of healing, because not all of the characters are going through the same thing, obviously, and they're all at different stages in their recovery, but they all use it ultimately to their advantage and are much stronger in the end because of it. Because of all the trauma and the hurt and the pain and the recovery and the healing that characters are going through, it's so important to keep the story light enough. At least that's what Sarah J Maas Maas ended up doing. I know that some authors choose not to, but I think that Sarah J Maas did a very nice job balancing the lightness and the freeness of a fantasy world, as well as still dealing with some of those darker themes, but overall keeping the story relatively light, or at least giving breaks to the darkness and the heaviness. A lot of this is done through characters' sense of humor and flirting, which is fun for the reader and keeps things much, much lighter than those darker themes. When the main character is really going through it, she didn't appreciate it at first, but eventually she starts realizing why one of the other characters keeps cracking jokes and flirting with her. That's because they realize how deep and dark the things she's going through are, and they're trying to keep her afloat enough to actually deal with the things that are going on. And it's not insensitivity like I kind of thought it was when I first read the book. It's to help her actually deal with the things that she's choosing to not really deal with when she's kind of drowning in those things. Hopefully this makes sense. This is kind of hard to talk about abstractly. If you are finding this informational and helpful and are enjoying this video so far, please give it a big thumbs up because it really supports my channel. The flirting and the humor do lend itself to something other than just lightening the mood, and that is kind of making the book a slow burn throughout almost the entire thing. Every time when a character is feeling down and then there's humor or flirting to kind of like pull themselves back out of it, they flirt for a little bit, there's humor, and then as soon as things like might get starting to get going, or like a move might be made or something, there's an interruption. Either they're getting physically close or they're joking about something, there's always an interruption. And it's either an outside force, like another character shows up and interrupts, there's an attack and that clearly interrupts, or sometimes what is said triggers something in the character's mind that brings their brain back to the plot and what's really going on. But whether it's external or internal, there's always an interruption that kind of fuels the slow burn for most of the book. Also, something that contributes to the slow burn is that characters might not be super into each other in the beginning, and they're using the flirting and the humor as coping mechanisms and techniques to get each other out of really hard moments, but that kind of grows throughout the book and gives us that slow burn, which is also another really great way to keep readers reading. Something that I did not realize on my first read through of this book, and really the whole ACOTAR series, was how important and integral the dreams are to the writing and the story itself. The dreams sort of track where characters are at with their healing and what their nightmares are and what their dreams are, and how often they have nightmares and how often they are not able to sleep through the whole night, to actually getting restful sleep and starting to show healing that way because they can actually make it through the whole night and sometimes have dreams instead of nightmares. And even when they do start sleeping better, you can tell that they might be going through something because there will be a bad dream, or they'll wake up in the middle of the night, or they won't be able to sleep well. And so it's a really good way to show and not tell where a character's headspace is at. Okay, so this one is kind of tricky to put into words without spoilers, but I am very set on that. And that's basically Chekhov's gun. In the book, there's a very closely knit, tight group of friends. And within that friend group, there's like the leader, because they're also all sort of in politics in this like world. There's the leader, his second, his third, and then his army generals. In this book, we find out what the army generals are capable of, but we do not figure out what the second and the third are capable of, meaning that we can only assume that they are stronger than the army generals. And so things have been hinted at only very vaguely, and I think that's kind of the key, is that these characters are here, we know they're strong, we know they're extremely capable of power, but we don't know what they can accomplish. And I think that's so cool because it makes them so menacing. And not even menacing because one of the two is like very light and cheery, has gone through a lot, yes, but is very, very upbeat and very outgoing and very friendly. And we kind of know that she's supposed to be this like incredible fighter, supposedly, because she's the third in command. But we actually don't find out what they are capable of until the third book. So totally an example of Chekhov's gun, and I love it so freaking much. It is also a little bit of foreshadowing, and I will touch more on foreshadowing later in this video. I did look up the definition of Chekhov's gun just so that I didn't get it wrong, but Chekhov's gun is a dramatic principle that states that every element in a story must be necessary and irrelevant elements should be removed. Elements should not appear to make false promises by never coming into play. And that's what I mean. The power and capability of these characters are roughly touched on, but they're not explained and they're not explicit. So we kind of know that they are really, really strong and capable, but we don't find out for a while. I believe how Chekhov's gun originated was that there was a gun sitting on a table in a play in Act 1, and therefore, before the end of the play, the gun must be used. And so we have these two really, really strong characters, and those powers need to be used before the end of the series. I thought that was so cool when I realized realize that it was Chekhov's gun in motion. Now, this is not just true for A Court of Mist and Fury, but all of the books that I've read by Sarah J Maas thus far, especially in the Throne of Glass series, is that characters outgrow other characters. And it is incredible because it's so true in real life. And so for that to be so perfectly personified in a book, that a relationship or a friendship could start out really, really well, and then one of the people outgrows the other one, or they drift apart or something, and that person can move on to finding other people that are more fitting to what they need at that moment. And so while various relationships and friendships start out as very beneficial, that they can go poorly, and that these characters can identify when that's happening, that they can move on. And then these characters can find other characters that will help them with wherever they're at in their lives. Basically, the characters can keep growing and becoming who they are meant to be through this transition and through this shifting of the people and characters, I guess, around them. That being said, there are a lot of changes of opinion and worldview in this book and this series. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of prejudices at the beginning of this book, a lot of very strong beliefs one way or another, and then throughout those books, those beliefs are then challenged and then changed accordingly. So basically, we have this evolving worldview from a lot of characters' perspectives, and it keeps things fresh and not stagnant, and keeps the plot moving along and characters developing and character arcs changing and working. Because really, there would not be much of a story if a lot of these characters stayed the same the entire time throughout. With all of this character growth throughout the book and this series, it is very easy to forget where the characters actually came from. And so Sarah J Maas does this very interesting thing in both the A Court of Thorns and Roses and the Throne of Glass series, where she has her characters in later books have to slip back into acting like they did at the beginning of the series. And that is such a freaking cool tool to show how far characters have come, and kind of show what they used to be like and what they're like now. And that touches a little bit on the healing and developing and growing with being around new people, but also for personal and selfish reasons. That is such a fun scene to read, because then you get to see how other people around that character expect that character to be acting. It's, oh my gosh, it is such a powerful moment and scene in like all of the books that it happens in. And I know for me at least, that is something that I'm trying to figure out a way that I want to incorporate that into one of my stories, because it is such a powerful storytelling technique to show how far some of the characters have come. In this story, we very much get a sense of like-minded people being drawn together, and a lot of that is trying to find oneself, and there are a lot of the characters that are looking for more of themselves in their friends, as well as trying to find people who are like-minded and trying to sort of shun the way that things have been done and try to like move into more of the current era. A lot of this in A Court of Mist and Fury is female empowerment, and that's done because there are a lot of societies in the book that have treated their females very poorly, but in this like super tightly knit political friend group, they are trying to find a way to improve things. They're trying to make things better for pretty much everyone. They're trying to promote a lot more of equality and moving society forward instead of staying rooted in the ways of the past, as traditional as they might be, because traditional does not mean that it's healthy. And so what I think I pulled from that is that like calls to like, and that people who want to change the world will come together because their conviction is so strong. With the level of emotion that does happen in this book, there is a couple of instances where a character's tongue slips out of anger or frustration, and they actually complicate the plot a little bit because they say something they're not supposed to say. And I find that fascinating, especially on the characters that have such a cool composure or so tight-lipped. When they do slip and then that complicates things, that's incredible, and it's so good. And it was just a really interesting technique to complicate the plot further, and was almost like super frustrating to the reader, but in like a good way, because this character is supposed to be so cool and composed, but they just like made a huge slip up, and that we know that immediately that's going to affect the plot and what happens to the world. So a very strong plot technique for sure. One of my favorite things, I think I found this somewhere online, I do not remember the source, and so I'm so sorry, but I think I found this somewhere online that said that a very effective storytelling technique is knowing when to share plans and not to share plans with the reader. What I mean, and something that is demonstrated very, very well in the A Court of Mist and Fury book, as well as the ACOTAR series in general, is explaining explaining what the plan is when plans are going to go wrong, and then not sharing plans when something is actually going to go correctly. And doing it this way allows for surprise in both ways so that it's not boring. Because if something is going to go wrong, it is important that the reader knows what was supposed to happen. That way they know what to expect, and then when things go wrong, that's surprising and intriguing. Whereas if things are going to go well, you don't want to have to write it twice, where you like write out the entire plan and then the characters do it flawlessly. Like, it doesn't convey as much intrigue written that way versus a surprise with plans going wrong or plans going correctly. It's all about the way you write it. And when I read that for the first time and then I noticed it happening in this book, I was blown away and so happy that Sarah J Maas included that. But it has also changed my brain as a reader. So whenever I notice that the author is including plans for something, I know that something's gonna happen, which kind of ruined it, but is also so fun that I can now recognize that. This is also something that I have started including in my own writing because it is one of the easiest to enact. Okay, the next section is like one of my favorite, and that is world building. And yes, world building is a huge portion, but world building is one of my favorite parts about writing, so this had to be touched on eventually. Throughout the A Court of Thorns and Roses series, so not just A Court of Mist and Fury, but also A Court of Mist and Fury, there are a lot of different creatures that are talked about and introduced, and it could be kind of easy to mix them up if the main character did not have very distinct encounters with each of them, and then never comes across more than one of them at the same time again. So they're kind of easy to keep apart for that reason specifically. And they look different and they act differently. And of course they have different names. But these creatures are all described differently because they have different purposes and their capabilities are different. But this like really adds to the world building that there are so many creatures, and even creatures that are not touched on, because there are things in the woods at one point that are hinted at but are never explicitly told to us what they are. So we only know the creatures that the character has come across, but we know that the world is much bigger outside of her experience. And I think that's so cool. The creatures are also feared for different reasons, and that helps keep them apart. So another facet of world building is the actual setting that the book takes place in. And with that, there are very distinct areas and sections of this world. And yes, that's very easy. I am going to include a picture of the map right here because you can see that there are different courts, and so each of the courts are very, very different. For example, like the spring court is basically just trapped in eternal spring. The autumn court is basically autumn all of the time. So you kind of get the gist that these various courts and lands are very distinct from one another. And because of that, it's very easy to also track the magic system and where people get their magic, because people in different courts have different magical abilities. So while there is not a crazy technical magic system within this book, that kind of helps like keep things together, because you know that the characters with stronger magical abilities in this court will be able to do this thing, and in this court they'll be able to do this other thing. Something else that I have to touch on is that each of the courts or the lands in this book have different festivals and or celebrate different celebrations and holidays and times of the year differently. There's one festival in the first book that there's something about like however that festival goes will affect the magic for the upcoming year. But the festivals that take place in A Court of Mist and Fury are much more specific to the court that they are in when the book is taking place. And I think that festivals also really help delineate and keep those various lands and stuff separate in the reader's brain because of how distinctive their celebrations and festivals are. Okay, so with world building, it is very, very easy to info dump. As I was reading, I was noticing that Sarah J Maas would never world build for more than like 2 or 3 paragraphs at a time, and she would always anchor it down at the end and bring the reader back to whatever's happening in the story. And it was never overwhelming, and it was always beneficial because the things that were mentioned almost always come back into play. But part of that is also because this is a series, and so even if things don't come back later in this book specifically, they might come back in later books. Okay, now we get to probably my favorite thing about rereading this book and the A Court of Thorns and Roses series is the sheer amount of foreshadowing that Sarah J Maas has put into these books. Like, oh my gosh. Somebody made a comment that these books were written to be reread, and as I'm rereading that, I totally see that. The sheer amount of foreshadowing can't even be picked up on like a second read through it. Like, I'm gonna have to reread reread the series again to get everything. And I think that the sheer amount of foreshadowing on top of the story and the characters and the plot itself brings readers back to wanting to read it again. But here's what I wanted to say about foreshadowing. Pretty much every available moment and sentence and word is geared toward plot or foreshadowing, aka future plot. What I mean is that there is no wasted space. Every comment, every dialogue snippet, even the things that the main character notices and wants to paint and does paint, even in the first book and before the first book, comes back into play, and we see, at least I saw in rereading, that the things that happen later on in the series were foreshadowed in both the first book and this book, and like they keep coming back. And so I already want to reread this book again because I know that I'm missing out on foreshadowing just because I haven't read this book in a while, but there is no wasted space. Every word is geared towards foreshadowing and plot, or at least eventual plot. It makes the story a bit cyclical, and I love that because everything that is included is important. As I'm working on draft 3 of the book that I'm currently writing, that is something that I am working on including more of, is just the sheer amount of foreshadowing and making sure that every sentence in the book deserves to be in the book. And I'm trying to add enough foreshadowing where it's not apparent on the first read through, but if somebody will choose to go back and reread my book, they will be noticing more things in the beginning, hinting at things throughout the book and that happen in the end. And even as I'm working on this draft 3, it's been very interesting to sort of look at it as I'm starting to think about books 2 and 3 of this series that I'm writing and kind of use the accidental foreshadowing that I wrote in book 1 to sort of help steer the plot in books 2 and 3. So the next one is how important it is to keep things from your reader. Yes, foreshadowing is incredibly important, but it needs to be done in such a way where it's not obviously apparent until the reader realizes what's happening and that you are really foreshadowing for it all along. You don't want the foreshadowing to be like glaringly obvious. The part where I talked about explaining plans versus not explaining plans is a great way of keeping information from the reader, and it can be sometimes a fine line on what to keep from the reader and what to not keep from the reader, and that's why having critique partners and beta readers is so important, because it is a very, very fine line, but it is important to keep some things from the reader, to keep some of the intrigue and some of the mystery, because even if the main character knows exactly what's going to happen and everything that's going on, the reader does not necessarily need to know, nor should they necessarily. And the last thing I learned about rereading A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J Maas is that the unpredictability of the ending is crucial. This book is such a page turner throughout, and then when you hit like 70% of the way through, you like cannot put the book down. That is, if you were able to before that. As I was reading, I was shocked at how the pacing seemed to speed up at the end, that I kind of felt like I was like barreling towards the end of the book. I was also shocked at how quickly the end of the book sort of seems to happen, and the unpredictability of it all, because you know that you're running out of pages as the book is wrapping up and coming to an end, and I love that about books when I'm reading. However, it's awful when I know that the next book in the series is not yet out, but it causes such a need for the next book. And a lot of this can be set up and done through foreshadowing, but I think the unpredictability of it and really trying to brainstorm all of the possibilities of what could happen at the end of the book to try and find the best and most effective one for your story is so, so important. All right, so with that, those are the things that I learned about writing from rereading A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J Maas. That is book 2 in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up because it really supports my channel by telling the YouTube algorithm that you liked my video and that someone else might too. Please let me know down below if you enjoyed this video or if you learned anything about writing or the books that you might not have noticed when you read them. I'm curious, or if you noticed something else in these books that you really admire and that taught you something about writing. That being said, if you are new here and not already subscribed, make sure you scroll down below, hit that big red subscribe button and that little notification bell next to it so that you get updated every time I upload a brand new video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm Sarah Lubratt, and I will see you guys next time with another video. Bye!